Alrighty, good afternoon. Welcome to Nikos RPG. I'm Jonathan Albin, and today we're going to talk about a subject that is near and dear to my heart, having been a writer, creator, developer for 50 years, and having published hundreds and hundreds of books as a ghostwriter, and 10 of my own, on top of course, the Nikos RPG role-playing system. The question of writer's block comes up, especially when I'm having a conversation with new and novice writers who themselves are concerned with the horrible horror stories that people have told about taking a long time to develop or create a story. And the questions that arise from that, we're going to be covering those in particular, and I'm going to be sharing my particular secrets on how I have completely avoided and obviated the very nature of this mystery, this mystique about writing. But before we do that, make sure you hit all the buttons down below. Let the algorithm know that you're a part of our audience. And let's get started, shall we? So when we talk about writer's block, there are, as I said, tons of horror stories that have been presented over the years, especially when dealing with prominent authors and a work that they perhaps have been avoiding or are delaying in producing or seem to be taking forever getting accomplished. And many of them ascribe it to this horror story known as the writer's block, the idea that a creator reaches a stymie point and simply cannot proceed any further until such time as they overcome this burden. And as I've said before, I'm a game master with 50 years of role-playing experience. That's a new session every week for 50 years. And in addition to that, I've been a ghostwriter and novelist and author, and I've published, by contract, I can't specify how many, but a considerable number, well into triple digits of volumes that I've published in the last 6 years. And in addition to those, I've also published 10 of my own now, which are available on Amazon.com. And I don't know if local bookstores yet carry it because I don't have a distribution deal. But instead, I'm the one who's actually producing the property on my own. And so the question becomes, how do I overcome this concept of writer's block? And I'm going to be going over that in several segments here. The first, I'm going to utilize the fuel tank analogy. If you have ever been in a car and you're driving from point A to point B, and you know you've got a certain number of miles to drive, and you know how much fuel is in your tank, and so therefore you're starting to near the end of that fuel supply, your thoughts turn to, what are my exit options? What are my possibilities for avoiding running out of gas? And you spend more time worrying about whether or not you're going to make it than perhaps might be warranted, because you've already calculated how many miles, you know how many gallons of fuel you started with. And so the ambiguity of whether you're going to accomplish it or not starts to weigh on your mind. And in many cases, a writer will find themselves feeling a pressure burden to accomplish that emulates that stress. And so what many people call writer's block is literally just overloading your creative energy with fear that you won't be able to accomplish it. And that itself is the burden that actually slows you down as you're considering your options rather than continuing to press on towards your goal. And the irony is that if you simply had continued to press on, you more than likely will have achieved your goal well within time and well within fuel, but because you started to worry about it, you actually cause yourself to have less to work with moment by moment, therefore adding to the pressure. This also usually is associated when you're working under a deadline, and so when we talk about dealing with the fuel tank analogy, the first thing I'm going to recommend, and the thing that I have found works really well for me, is to front load the work. In other words, when you are of the mind to create and just continue as long as humanly possible to accomplish as much of the task early in the process, so that the fuel tank burden, this psychological pressure you bring to bear on yourself, doesn't become unmanageable. Again, even from day one, you're worried about whether or not you can accomplish it, but by pressing forward when you feel inspired, you actually feel the energy amplify and continue utilizing that as much as possible, and that overcomes this fuel tank fear. Pardon me. Okay, number 2 is the concept of the creativity siphon. Let's say you're working on a project for your actual occupation, and you're working on either your games group session, or you're working on the next chapter in whatever book you're working on. Quite often, when you feel that energy to create, your natural defenses are going to be to shove that energy into the hopper for the actual work you're doing, because you know that it has to be your higher priority, and therefore you are drawing from that creativity pool and putting it into another resource. And this is dangerous for a couple of reasons. Number one is that psychologically, our creativity is tied to our desire to work. And when we take that energy that could be focused on our project and we put it instead towards the physical work that we do, we are siphoning off that energy and giving our minds permission to downshift, so to speak, to adjust our output to match the actual work. And the problem with that is that when you do need that creativity siphon, to that creativity to finish your objective and complete the project, it's often already been drawn down because you've utilized it for other resources. So the way we can avoid this, the way we can prevent falling into this particular trap, is to, again, utilize that creativity for the purpose that we have intended for it. So if we're excited about writing a project and we're unable to work on it right now, learn to utilize that creativity siphon to fill that psychological tank we were talking about. So you're actually preventing the first form of error by over amplifying when you can. But the idea here is to not fall into the trap of this siphon, because when you do, you get used to that lower level of energy and therefore prevent yourself from being able to complete simply because you misused that energy earlier in the process. The reality is that our creativity spans a bunch of different environments. If we are a creator of fiction, let's go with game design or role play session design first. There are so many pieces that go into each of those game sessions that you have a variety of things that you could be using that creativity on. And if you only utilize, the tool of the keyboard and working on the project, then you're undermining your ability to create. So, for example, if I'm doing an occupational job, like, for example, writing a book, I may be actually utilizing some of the mental energy during those moments of writing to also be considering, for example, how a combat table might work, or how I might want to modify a particular factor of the story. In other words, do not consider yourself to only have one set of tools, but instead consider the arsenal that we have to work with. We have our creativity, we have our visualization, we have the actual notes, we have maps, we might have a collection of miniatures. By having a wide array of tools at our disposal, we can change them out. This concept of the arsenal approach means that we're able to stay on the creative angle even as we switch out which tools we're using, and thereby continue to spawn creativity. Towards the conclusion of our project, but perhaps in a variety of forms, so that at any given point we aren't working on any one of them in particular. And this ties back somewhat to the gas tank analogy, and a story I want to tell. I think I'll wait for a minute to get to that. But the idea is that when you are, say, being creative, do not limit yourself to one set of creativity tools, but in other words, use more than one. So writing notes on your campaign is one concept. Writing out actual narrative is another. Visualizing the actual play experience and how players might interact, and working through all of these dramatic pieces individually gives us a wider arsenal of tools to work from, and therefore reduces our chance of a writer's block point. This leads, therefore, to the idea of working on your projects not as a single holistic piece, but instead of the variety of the different tools that you will use, and determine what is your best assembly line process. In the Imagination Launchpad process that I developed, that you can find in my most recent book, The Way of the Game. I'll put a link for that down below. But that process you actually break into working blocks, so that each working block is an accountability framework that you can set up for each of your project subtitles, so that you can work through them. And for each person it'll be different, and certain people will have no real pattern. Others will say, okay, well, I'm going to work on my notes from, say, 9 until noon, and then I'm going to work on the actual narrative from noon until 2, and then I'm going to work on the setting from 2 until 3. The idea is you start to develop a process by which the pieces can be created within that framework. And what that does, that permits your mind to put at rest whether or not it's going to be worked on, but instead defines when it will be worked on, so that it's easier for you to hold onto those mechanisms going forward, and becomes a pattern, and a pattern is easier to replicate once it becomes familiar. So I'm going to tell a story. This actually did happen, about 5 years ago now. I was exploring what I was capable of, and originally I was writing, one book in a long series and taking 6, 8, 10 weeks to accomplish it. And what I found in that process is that there was just as much energy taken in each of the phases of that creation process as the whole would be in long term, but it was literally one at a time, and it was custom. It was, arguably more directly relatable piece over piece, but it was not. It was a toil. It was a burden. So by developing this mechanism of the assembly line, then now I could start working on 2, 3, 4 projects at a time, dedicating, for example, one day to locations, and another day to characters, and another day to interactions. And by having a panoply of projects working, I was able to therefore take on more than one contract. And so at one point I was writing 3, 4, 5, 6 books a week, and I got to the point where I was doing an ebook in about a week or a week and a half, and a novel in a month, and perhaps a series or multi-book deal over a period of 3 to 6 months. But by utilizing the assembly line process, I could then pick up additional projects, because my creativity wasn't ever running near the end of the tank, so to speak, because I wasn't working on a singular project. I was working on multiples of them. And so at the fastest I was operating, I was actually writing 7 books a week. And what I found fascinating is the fact that after my second week of operating on 7 projects at a time, I was pumping out completions in the same amount of time, But lo and behold, at the end of the time when those 7 projects were at deadline and sent off to their relative connections, I found that I had an entire additional book completed because I'd taken the bits, snippets and bits from the others, thrown them into this collective file, and then as my brain was working on the different projects, I would drop into that file and connect the pieces within that to create this additional book. But I didn't realize that was what I was doing. But the reality is that by the time I'd finished 7 books, I'd actually written an entire additional book. It wasn't associated with the others because it had been the conglomerate of all the various pieces, and yet it made a coherent story, and therefore I was able to write 8 books in the time that took for me to normally write 7, and I ended up with this extra title. And this was to me a revelation, because it meant now I could be creative on everything I was working on all at the same time and still be able to be innovative and creative within that framework and end up with this 8th story. Now, I tell you that to say I wouldn't recommend it. When you're operating that many projects and processes at the same time, it's rather daunting. And had it not been for my time as an air traffic controller, I probably wouldn't have been able to be as disciplined as I needed to be to do so. But the idea is that that 8th title really proved to me that the mechanism for the Launchpad really does work, that when you set up the working blocks and you operate with those working blocks and you utilize the disciplinary controls that you put in for yourself, you can have a greater output than you expected. Now, as my grandfather would say, I told you all of that to tell you this. And here I'm going to talk about the see to me. Now, most of you are far younger than I am and have not watched the old Lassie TV show. And that's a long time ago, and it was a television program where a collie, a dog by the name of Lassie, was the pet of a young boy named Tim. And Tim would get into all kinds of antics and situations, and always at the end of the episode, I think it was Uncle Joe would show up, and Uncle Joe would take Timmy aside and put his hand on Timmy's shoulder and say, this is all what has happened this week, but you see, Timmy, this is why these things happened, because of this ramification and this condition and this set of situations. And it was fundamentally like Aesop's fable. It was the moral to the story. And so I've always come to think of it as the see to me moment. And in this case, the see to me of writer's block is that writer's block occurs when you've pushed yourself on the creative aspect, pushing down on the pedal, so to speak, so fast that you burned through the fuel that you had in the tank. Our brains are resilient entities and work to provide us with answers to our challenges and give us the opportunities to conclude. And when we are focused on a singular project and a singular methodology for accomplishment, then it makes it impossible for it to come to fruition. So the see to me here is to take a look at your process. If you are a writer and a creator and you always start at such an hour and you always work for this number of hours and you always when you set all of those, yes, you must do things in order. You threaten yourself. You give yourself no opportunity for the inspiration and insight that comes from being creative. So the see to me here is, don't feel that you're having to work on a given project in a certain order in order to be successful. You can accomplish it as long as you keep a disciplined eye on what it is you're trying to accomplish and look to how you're going to accomplish it and provide for yourself a process for that creativity to come to light. So you see, Timmy, when you are a writer, you write. Sometimes the writing fits this bucket, sometimes it fits another bucket, but by having multiple locations, multiple options that you can work on, you do not give yourself opportunity to run the tank dry, so to speak. And so, in my case, I've never had a moment of writing block, simply because there's always something else to work on and another way to look at it that provides you with the insight to make your creativity pop again. So do what you can to break your elemental process down so that you can identify how to link them together to give you the best outcome. Alrighty, this is the end of the episode for today. I want to thank you for being here. I'm Jonathan Albin. If you want to know more about the Imagination Launchpad system and such, check out nikosrpg.com. If you want to know more about the Nikos RPG game system, I'll put the link down below for the Shopify store. We've got a deal for retailers to guarantee keystone pricing. So if you are a retailer or know a retailer, make sure you give them the link and the information to get in touch with me, and I'll give them the ability to get that keystone price. Other than that, thank you for being here, and maybe I'll see you in the next episode. Make sure that between now and then you keep it rolling. Have a great day.